in Gaza, he said, speaking to his fellow Israelis, he said, you cannot just land blows, leave the Palestinians in Gaza in economic distress, and expect that Hamas will just sit around and do nothing. It's easy enough to condemn the Hamas rocket and mortar attacks on Israel, and all the human rights organizations did in fact do so. But it seems to me if you want to condemn them, you still have an obligation to show what other options did they have. If you don't show what other options they had, you're in effect saying that the people of Gaza had a legal and moral responsibility, obligation to just lie still and die. In any event, Israel decided to expedite the process, accelerate it, and so on December 27th, it launched its attack on Gaza. The attack lasted 22 days, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction. Well, what happened during those 22 days? Nowadays, when people refer back to those 22 days, they refer to it as the Gaza War. There was a war in Gaza. Even respected human rights organizations, a number of their reports have Gaza War in the title or the subtitle. And in fact, Israel was very emphatic that there was a war in Gaza. They were very proud of that war because they said afterwards, now we've shown the Arabs who's who and what's what, and who's in charge in this corner of the world. And how did we do it? Well, we won the war in Gaza. We won the war in Gaza. But then along came an Israeli strategic analyst, and he said, it's very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days of fighting. A former Israeli foreign ministry official, he said there was no war. Hamas sat in its bunkers and came out when it was all over. Well, if there was no war in Gaza, what did happen in Gaza? On a military level, or military plane, it's pretty straightforward. No reason to doubt the Israeli statistics. It began what they call the air phase of the invasion. And by the end of the 22 days, Israelis had flown between 2,800 and 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. Every plane returned. Not a single plane was downed. In fact, not a single plane was damaged, which is not altogether too surprising because the people of Gaza had no anti-aircraft defenses to speak of. After the first week, Israel began what it called its land and ground phase of the assault. The Israeli soldiers, they had special night warfare equipment. Hamas couldn't even see them, let alone fight them. So, no battles, no planes downed, no planes even damaged. Hamas couldn't even see the Israelis as they entered Gaza. So what happened in Gaza? In fact, we have a pretty clear picture of what happened from what a lawyer might call unimpeachable testimony. It's the testimony of the Israeli soldiers themselves, who after the 22 days publicly gave witness to what they personally experienced in Gaza. Soldier, there was nothing there, ghost towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, Usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course, not a soul. Soldier, go ahead, ask the other soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing. No one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entering Gaza, but there just wasn't any. Sounds kind of surreal. A war with only one side. It's kind of funny. And it would be funny were it not for the other half. And for the other half, you should check for yourself. All you have to do is go to your computer and enter in the Google, enter breaking the silence. And and then what will come up on the screen is a collection of testimonies of the soldiers who were in Gaza. And then all you have to do is enter under the search function, enter the word insane. And if you enter the word insane, it'll come up once, insane, twice, insane, 3 times insane, 4 times insane, 5 times insane, 6 times insane. The soldiers, they were interviewed separately. They weren't cueing each other, but the same word kept leaping to mind. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. No battles. No enemy in the field. No foe to tangle with. But Israel's using insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. One soldier said, "This was firepower such as I had never known. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking." Another soldier said, "On the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that actually rocked the outpost. Some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse." They enter Gaza, commandeer Palestinian homes. They're firing into the horizon. But the insane amounts of firepower are causing the ground underneath their feet to quake. So they're told to abandon the houses. So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, the soldiers themselves came up with the best similes and metaphors. One soldier said, "It felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game." Another soldier said, "You felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants." You felt like a child with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. I was a kid once. I had my magnifying glass. I'm not very proud of it in retrospect. You're smiling, sadist. I focused the rays of the sun on the anthills, turned the ants into crispy critters. As I said, I'm not very proud of it anymore, but I didn't suffer from the delusion back then that I was engaged in a war with the ants. In fact, the comparison was very apt. One of the substances Israel used in Gaza was the white phosphorus. Now, Israel always uses the white phosphorus. I remember as far back as 1982, during its attack on Lebanon, the use of the white phosphorus. I never paid much attention to the details. It had an ominous sounding name, white phosphorus. But this time I did look at the details. white phosphorus, it reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 816 degrees Celsius. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As Oprah would say, try wrapping your mind around that one. So what did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Well, Human Rights Watch put out a report called Rain of Fire on what happened in Gaza. And here's what Human Rights Watch had to say. Israel repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. They dropped the white phosphorus on a school. They dropped the white phosphorus in the marketplace. They dropped the white phosphorus in the humanitarian aid warehouse. They dropped the white phosphorus on 2 hospitals, Al-Quds Hospital and Al-Wafa Hospital. According to Human Rights Watch, the hospitals were clearly marked, and there does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. By the end of the 22 days, 1,400 Palestinians were killed, of whom up to 4/5 were civilians, and 350 were children. On the Israeli side, 13 Israelis were killed, of whom 10 were combatants, 3 civilians. Of the 10 combatants, 4 of the 10 were killed by other Israelis by accident, what's called technically friendly fire. So all told, for every 100 Palestinians killed, 1 Israeli was killed. For every 400 Palestinian civilians killed, 1 Israeli civilian was killed. And now you have to ask yourself, you use your judgment, 100 to 1, 400 to 1. Does that sound like a war? Or does it sound like a massacre? Every time you hear anyone refer to the Gaza war, a journalist, a friend, or even yourself, you become an instrument, witting or unwitting, of Israeli propaganda. There was no war in Gaza. There was a massacre in Gaza. But of course, Israel has its explanations. It always does. It's very rational and meticulous. So they said, well, there was a lot of death in Gaza. It wasn't our fault. There was a lot of destruction. It wasn't our fault. Because, you know, those Hamas people, they're not just crazy, they're cowards. They hid behind the Palestinians, forced the Palestinians to serve as human shields. And so they forced us to kill civilians. We didn't want to, but what option did we have? So, how many of you in the audience have heard the allegation that Hamas used civilians as human shields? Raise your hand. Yeah, you'd have to be, either brain dead or making excessive use of mind-altering drugs not to have heard it. I know people at U of P are not brain dead. The second possibility, I don't know. Not to have heard the allegation. It's so pervasive, and it was so widely disseminated. And of course, all the human rights organizations, they investigated that allegation because it was Israel's main alibi. By now, there have been, believe it or not, about 300 separate reports written on what happened in Gaza. And all the human rights organizations reached the same conclusion. They all concluded there's no evidence that Hamas engaged in human shielding. So if I were to ask this young woman in the first row, what's the most respected human rights organization in the world, you would answer,
Amnesty International.
Yeah, Amnesty International, the Nobel laureates for peace. So Amnesty International, in fact, it did an exhaustive study of the issue of human shielding by Hamas. And here's what they concluded. Contrary to